Hello everyone, today we talk about the Vikings, the Varangians and the Rus for our Eurasian Steppes Warfare series. We will essentially epitomize with the military techniques, the kind of general profile of these fighters, their arms, armor, and so on. I think it's important to include all these three in the steppes space. This is kind of the most sedentary video of the series, likely. Well, perhaps there will be something similar in the future. And as you know, these peoples here, technically some are, part of the same thing, right? If you say the Varangians are just different ways of talking Vikings and Russians, if depending on the type of, let's say, of definition, cut, emphasis, accent that you want to put on this or that meaning, right? Naturally, there are differences as well, but we're talking, after all, about a substantially compact type of, if anything, of warriors. So military culture, essentially straddling this Norse Slavic world, and in part beyond, because the point here is showing how these peoples also went consistently abroad across the steppes up to the Caspian Sea, beyond, as first of all as war bands, right, involved also in trade activities and so on, smuggling, raiding, all the things were combined, of course, and there would have not been a Viking era if there had not been a florid slave trade in the first place. And this character is fascinating to evaluate, because you realize that there was no, say, external reason for this thing to happen. There was not probably even a specific environmental reason, right, for this thing being put together. Just the exploitation of the political situation, and so the will, the enterprising spirit, the greed, right, the excitement, right, the imperialistic fantasies. I mean, all these peoples had naturally a full traditional imperial view of reality, and they were declining it according to their own possibilities. Also, the spaces are interesting because they're huge. They stretch from the forests of Eastern Europe to, in fact, the steppes, the Pontic one, the one continuing along the Caspian, the Caucasus, reaching actually up to Central Europe. We're not talking just about the Slavs, but there are in the forests. There are the Ugrafins in the northeast. There are still big empires around, such as the Khazar one that we illustrated partly in its military culture before. And we have naturally also a scanned kind of a, let's say, a Viking era in development, right? That there is a sort of early, mid, and late Viking era that all correspond to certain specific changes, mechanism in power in the Norse politics, society, and so on. We shall talk a bit more about the Viking era, because we really didn't make it so much. That instead allows to at least appreciate certain dynamics also in the evolution of Germanic, Slavic warfare, the relation also with the broader Frankish world, with other similar cultures like the Anglo-Saxons, for example, that at some point enter more this northern Norse or Norsified, we can say, space before the Frankish Norman conquest. So all things that we will go step by step through, hopefully. But today we concentrate specifically on the Baltic, the great Russian rivers, the relation between this essentially Germanic Norse war bands, their political as military role in the Slavic societies, and how the latter essentially managed to exploit them, right? To consolidate local powers that eventually remain under an originally Norse dynasty or broader family, but it was married into the Slavic aristocracy. The latter, which, however, made really the whole thing happen in the first place. And so what we're looking at here, in spite of the kind of the Norse influence, is still fundamentally a Slavic power, right? That remained such and essentially went beyond also technically what was happening in Scandinavia. So as always, it's a matter of elites moving a lot, but fundamentally the power base having to do with the decisive moral support of the locals, without which it wasn't really anything possible. And the relations were more strained than we think. At least there were extremes in this. Eastern Europe, like a great many European areas, became in the 8th century the arena of the activity of these Scandinavian Vikings. Right here, I don't have to talk about the etymologies. You know, at least the term Viking is debated in its meaning, but at the same time, we all know perfectly well what this was. These were essentially pirates. I don't think there is a better way to define them. There was a mercenary character to them. So a more strictly military one. We could call them warlike and mercantile bands of some sort, consisting of usually free commoners, right? The so-called bonds, right? That, however, stemmed from essentially a dark background, in as much as they were often outlaws, banned from the originary communities for some offense. There were also higher profile elements that fundamentally led the whole enterprise. We're talking about nobles, earls, etc. As we've seen in the videos about medieval Scandinavia, talking about, say, the free commoner is a very vague way of addressing the thing, because there wasn't such a simple category in the truest traditional meaning, right? Freedom is immediate in the moment in which any person has a worth, and that's how juridically too that people were actually evaluated. And aside from the fact that the elites had always been ruling, and that already Scandinavia had been witnessing a process of social stratification that the Viking era just enhanced, what you have is, say, a pretty shaded picture in which, especially the Vikings, in fact, would challenge the pre-existing order based on a somehow strict control, right? Also carried out by the religious and political elite that had been naturally watching with suspicion upon every element that wanted to essentially seize control, right? And so to, in a way, also advance the system, right? Creating more hierarchical, cohesive, and centralized system by a degree which, this is a bit what the popular culture instead has unfortunately subverted of the Viking era, right? That very far from being, the symbol of the average kind of free, authorityless, fourth estater that thinks that there shouldn't be any order, somebody ruling above. The Vikings embodies at least over time, their accomplishment by Scandinavian standard, the most traumatically violent as successful enforcement of a hierarchical order aimed at crushing, right, the chaos, right, basically the incredibly poor political stability of the system before, through these kind of raids, right, and that were not just destined south towards to hit the most developed areas of Central Western Europe, and beyond. Also because that thing stopped at the end of the day, because those peoples, in fact, were stronger, more compact, and kicked the Vikings out. But in that sense, also against the same Scandinavian, accumulating loot, slaves, power, concentrating in it, and basically unhinging the traditional, say, at least the primitive Scandinavian society for what it had been affirmed before, with this kind of, let's not make everybody exploit our potential, right? The Viking era represents in many ways this constant in Western history that you can see from the Romans to the Napoleonic era, whatever, where there are this kind of outcasts that were basically told to have lost any chance to redeem themselves, and that now were given instead a chance by the elite, right? By conquering, by expanding, by, in this sense, proving what they were made of, and compacting, a much greater power in a civilizational sense, right? And this is the future of Scandinavia, right? There is not just the Viking era, right? Feudal Scandinavia is very interesting and fascinating, but for some reason, of course, the new religion of the lesser people today consists in thinking that a bunch of Mordirs just per se, right, embodies a sort of lawlessness against the authority, the terrible elites that want to globalize the world, because these people wanted to conquer the entire world themselves if they had been able to, like any other power at the time. Instead, today, the paranoia, of course, the demonstration of the radical human inferiority that is being produced by people that are, of course, not capable of doing anything of this kind anymore, makes people ever more superstitious, scared, fearing that there is somebody above them, simply because they are not enough as human beings to be above themselves. And this is the deepest meaning that the Viking era has, right? Just also for all those things who say, I am like a Viking. They're full of mentally alienated kids that today actually believe these things, right? Even if they had been connected with them in any way, if a Viking had actually seen normally what one of these kids are today, I don't think that much of the physical consistency of the kid would remain to be appreciated, right? And this is one of the most interesting things, also because Northeastern Europe is one of the most radically and traumatically violent, underdeveloped, brutal, and viciously, bloody reality you can imagine throughout all, perhaps not all the ones we have seen, because the steppes is, even more disturbing in that regard. But definitely we are in places that even after the Viking era didn't actually shine for particular, wealth, development, or civilizational accomplishment. But again, the step that was taken at this point was magnitudinal for those who actually carried it out in the relative terms of the potential, where they were coming from with that, and what they were able to achieve, right? This is the interpretation I give, basically, the entire civilization in the first place. But unfortunately, when I say the media, I even mean not the terrible media ruled by the terrible people. I'm talking about what, again, the fourth estaters watch normally on Netflix, right? Thinking that it's kind of history, because they, that's the only thing they can afford, basically, to be cultivated, again, as paranoid rats, under their, say, timely superstition. But something, again, that should instead be learned much more powerfully since childhood, and that, unfortunately, parenthood is absolutely unprepared to do in the 21st century, anywhere in the world, by the way. Never mistake the thinking that I don't know, there are other peoples in the world that have those deep vows. No, they're all dramatically fallen, humanly speaking. The best existence in the world is the West, and there is no doubt about this under any political, military, social, moral, cultural point of view. Again, if you want to thicken the ranks of the alienated, paranoid people that cannot accept their own, their own condition, and have to cope with their inferiority complexes, just do it. You will be our next slaves, quite soon. That's how a Viking would reason, by the way. That's literally what there is nothing more beautiful than the difference in value between human beings. There is nothing more beautiful than properly appreciating, assessing the worth of people. And as you know, in the Norse society, it was the entire thing. It was literally people cost different amount of wealth, right? And that was based, of course, on a moral judgment. It was based on what these people were made of, right? As primitive as it is, in a way, it's because it could be done. That was viable for the stage of development which they were at that point. And never mistake what happens today when we give that fixed standard just to simplify the thing, because we have to cope with much stronger forces in absolute terms, as if you could compare the two things without context, right? So it's incredibly important to start from this concept, because otherwise, if you don't understand this, well, just bail out of history entirely, right? There is not going to be, TV series, reenactors, whichever other bullshit you think has anything to do with history, to give you any trace of any form of morality or scientific information that you can't think, right? The only way to know these things is studying this thing, spitting blood and sweating tears for decades in your life, sacrificing basically everything you have. Otherwise, just, again, I don't know, just go do something else that you're more useful there. So, as we were saying, the Vikings were seafaring merchants and pirates, right? But on the mainland, they acted, military-wise, as food companies, right? Their warfare was mostly infantry-based, even though we shouldn't absolutely underestimate it, especially in this Eastern European context, especially towards the steppes, how horsemanship was actually a thing, right? It's not much that the Norse didn't use horses much at war. It's just that they didn't have a political cohesion that was capable of conferring that level of collective training necessary to have a strong cavalry, right? This would happen only in feudal societies, later on also in Scandinavia, a bit later, a bit more gradually, and still probably less than in other, especially in the Frankish regions of Europe. But the thing was already there, and actually Norse warfare shows a consistent amount of mounted combat. Even just numerically speaking, we have, even impressive numbers, 1/3, 1/4 of the hosts mounted. We know that the Viking ships had specific, that there were specific type of ships for horses carrying. And generally speaking, digging even in the previous times, in the Vandal era and so on, that, of course, according to in the best Indo-European tradition, the hero of the situation is always a horseman, right? This is present in every single European mythology, culture, and the emphasis on that should be always, in fact, increased, because, especially as far as the Greeks and the Romans go, we've been convinced that there was a world in which there was some kind of democratic republic in which all people were equal and all this bullshit. Those were some of the most rigidly oligarchic, feudally minded, ultra-elite based, militaristic, imperialistic cultures that are basically the manifesto of Indo-European civilizations, and it is quite hard to this point of historical and archaeological inquiry to go around saying, well, all these peoples were not fixated with the only purpose of taking over the world, because of course they were concerned in, saving themselves together with all the people that they cared about and the world entire, just by the way, and that was the only mean through which achieving it. However, it is true that overall, the Norse war bands fought prevalently on foot, and this is something really understandable, also considering the ground on which they were fighting. I mean, there's no determinism in that, again, mounted warfare counts, especially as far as it is collectively qualitative, and you can always fight on horseback by a degree. The important, though, is what is convenient, in fact, on a large scale engagement, considering the terrain, the enemy, the general obstacles. And so in quite marshy, forested areas, crossed by major rivers, with some, very difficult grounds, also for, as it's witnessed, also by the same limit of the steppe, right? Environmentally, that you can't say that the steppes rulers could at some point even exact tributes, etc., from the peoples of the forest and so on, but they quite rarely ventured in the forest because that was not really admittedly there was less in there in the first place, and if there hadn't been things would have gone somehow differently, or at least they would have tried to change things. However, the general thing is that infantry has an important advantage at this point. These are not feudal societies in the conventional sense of the term. So a strong cavalry, by definition, cannot exist unless you have a feudal society. And fighting also just dismounted for somebody who moved on horseback and also fought on horseback, but normally, again, having to storm, for example, fortresses, which is also yet another thing that I think it's dramatically overlooked in the entire medieval warfare. That is to say that, infantry is good at best blockading a fortress, but it's the actual dismounted men-at-arms that are the stormtroopers of the situation. They're the only ones who have the panoply, the training, the physique to actually carry that out. So in Scandinavia, you definitely see an heroic brutality, which is very difficult to explain in modern terms from a psychophysical point of view, but that obviously corresponds to this more fragmented political reality, where unavoidably, again, in order to compensate for that lack of coercive force and consequent collective training, those who would invest a lot in individualistic qualities, militarily wise, which, generally speaking, sucks, especially against more civilizationally advanced peoples. But that, by this period in the High Middle Ages, is not really, dramatically distant from the same. And again, the hybrids are, really shading this to the opposite extremes, right? So, of course, especially in a war, not even in continental Europe, telling the truth, cavalry, as you know, was decisive, for example, right? Even in the Frankish lands, you have to wait basically the mid-12th century for having cavalry as literally dominating the battlefield, knowing that they would always fight together with infantry, and they needed it because it was all about combined armed tactics at any time. But we start there seeing basically until we don't start seeing until the early 14th century any infantry winning alone on the battlefield. You couldn't have infantrymen that could withstand powerful blows for a while, even a day of fighting, but eventually would break and flee if they didn't have cavalry support. Well, Scandinavia in the Viking era is really different, right? Infantry is much stronger, and the guys that make it up are also really tough overall. Again, not until the Vikings themselves developed a sort of semi-professional, fully professional system with, as we'll see now, some proper retinues that would be at war their entire life and so on. You do not find, admittedly, much of a military quality, because that's the entire thing, right? Otherwise, it would have been just tribal warfare, right? There are very tough elements that can form the front of the phalanx, you could argue, but the maneuverability of the system, the combined armed tactics are very much reduced, and so it's not a big deal. Just later, when the Norse began to create true say, overseas empires. Think about the one of Knut the Great, are able to, again, pay for large amounts of troops, right, professional troops, even just temporarily, right? You have a more generalized kind of level of professionalism, and you see the traditional way of war, the seasonal one, the tribal one, basically declining. The history of the berserkers, for example, I made some couple of videos of berserkers, Ulfatnars, and so on. You know that during the early Viking era, for Scandinavian standards, there were something, because they were some of the fiercest, more capable warriors and so on. By the mid-Viking era, what you have is that some sort of semi-professionals that are specialized in certain combat techniques and so on. And by the late Viking era, basically berserkers are outdated, anachronistic. They're just a bunch of marauders, not even farmers are so upset anymore by them, because again, politics in society has changed and things have developed consistently also towards the feudal military organization that is surely more advanced than the one that had been existing in the Viking era, in spite of, again, the dramatic moral forces that were displayed, right? But that corresponded a bit to that hunger, right, and that need of adventure and taste for loot and similar stuff going around. These food companies were known in Old Norse as drots, from which the Finnish rutsi, and the Swede, basically, given that at least most of the Norse that came to Eastern Europe, at least were roaming the Baltic, were say from the closer Sweden generally, but it's just a rule, not a law, from which also the Slavic Rus, the Russians, and I made a video just about the origins of the Kievan Rus, where we analyzed a bit these etymologies, these influences. So again, for a more civilian background, you can look at that, but we digressed widely on the military nature of that dominion. So what really happened through their seafaring entrepreneurship, let's say, the Vikings gradually settled in the centers of intertribal and international, say, barter along the Volga road from the Baltic to the Caspian Sea. These areas, as you've seen while talking about the Khazar Empire, were really strategic as far as trade and not only was concerned, because basically they connected the Middle East, right? The era of Persia, the Caliphate, with powerful elites that sometimes hired these troops as well, aside from just fighting against them, by the way. They were consistent, right? Again, we would be probably amazed by, if we really had a real kind of visual possibility, a map with all the dots, with all the clashes, raids, violence that the Norse carried out against these people, scattered again in this random kind of Western Eurasian space, and how far they went, because we know they went very far, much more far than we think. Also establishing lordships in places like, Anatolia, around the Caspian. This thing did happen. After all, that's what their mentality was. They weren't tied. They had, of course, always an awareness of the Scandinavian origins. There are beautiful runic stones that illustrate, as you know, in this Germanic tradition. I mean, the remember, at least those who had died in faraway places. There were some other traditions that you see during the migration era, these poles with a bird, an eagle, fixed in the terrain, and the bird indicating the direction of the land where these merchants or warriors had died. So very, very interesting, even touching stories, right? Until you realize what these people were going toward, but you can't avoid to romanticize them. That comes standard, because again, if you read the entire sagas, and so this sense of the traditional struggle, right, between the determined and the undetermined, between the destiny and the hero, which is able to take the destiny, and changing it, right, and fundamentally opening the way to heaven, to the Valhalla, and the higher, like what would have been salvation. Actually, already at this time, Scandinavia had, as we understand from the sagas, undergone the same process that, say, the whole world 1,000 years after Augustan times had basically experienced, like, the sense of fatigue, of darkening, again, the storming of the Asgard, the age of the wolf approaching. As you know, these people are very aware, in many ways much more, in fact, than any other at this point, of the continuous crippling of the world's foundation, the erosion by the universal snake, evil. And so the idea of sin, the idea that behind every death and immortality there is a fault, right, of man. And so this considering the lifestyle this man had, really makes you reflect, because they knew it was just like a Russian roulette, right? Nevertheless, the only way to break the thing was exactly going for it and trying to defy destiny in that way and see how far it went. This corresponds to the second person of the Clausewitzian Trinity, and it's properly the military taste for gamble, as far as the game is, war is a game, both objectively and subjectively, and it basically the only way to play it is to risk a lot. And so this space what we just described was activated in trade by the Vikings, also because they had started making lots of slaves, right? Especially from places like Francia, England, and many other areas. There were the same Slavic areas that were already in the Finnish space. A lot of essentially Norse colonization. There was the Celtic French. So wherever they went, taking some slave was always something. This was done also by, for example, some war bands would take en masse a congruous amount of women and deport them to some land that would settle and down with, right? This is the case. Also, some genome being analyzed. We know, lots of Irish women being deported places like Iceland, right? Just to, because it was both. Again, the idea behind this was, again, the warrior had to take his own space, right? His own life, right? And even though a war, say a sacred brotherhood of warriors would, of course, be so in virtue of an oath sworn to a leader that was at the same time just a medium of God, and so there was, in theory, like an absolute boundary there to reach. Still, for most of these people, the thing was seizing a better land than the one we're coming from, and just starting a new life wherever. Again, as we said before, there was a great deal of political exiles and political turbulence. Those who succeeded the most could even come back, and with the riches they would have hopefully accumulated, attracting larger amounts of warriors, starting to subjugate people around within the same Scandinavia. But sometimes it was just moving elsewhere. And slaves were the most precious, lucrative, and commodity, the one that, again, made the entire Viking era exist in the first place, right? So all these slaves were sold. Normally, the Vikings would raid Christians, right? So this was obvious, considering that the areas they attacked were normally Christianized. Some of these Norse were already Christians, right? By the way, but most of Scandinavia was, of course, Christianized without autonomously, very spontaneously, aside from the broader political decision eventually to standardize, to uniform that, also for the sake of establishing a more stable, more solid power locally, receiving international support, recognition, cooperating, but making things more orderly, right? But in general, slave trade was quite lucrative in this broader northern crescent, let's say, that reached the eastern markets as well, and was quite florid, right? The proof that this was temporary, right? It exploited also the crisis of the Carolingian Empire, right, rather than causing it, by the way, and let's say slavery was basically a very recent thing. So for most areas of Central Europe as well. So we should always be careful even there in categorizing. Like, what is a slave actually? What is a serf instead? Right? As we were saying before, every person has a price. So there's not such a precise categorism. In any case, we know a few about, say, the everyday situation there. Just we know that this human trafficking was pretty much the core of the matter, and that many trade centers of the Viking era, especially in the Baltic, rose and fell with the Viking era, because they were just about slave trade, and there was basically no other resources locally that would otherwise make him rise, right? So this is also archaeologically well famous, right, and for the studies of the Viking era, right? That most of the wealth the Scandinavians accumulated there was transient because it was literally taken from other places. This is, again, particularly important that you understand how mechanically stimulating this would be for Viking activity, because otherwise it would have not happened in the first place. So again, today we don't have the time to digress on this cause-effect mechanisms, but I think it renders the idea. As we were just saying, the Norse settled a bit everywhere across this main, especially across the Russian rivers, in the main trade centers. They were the most populated ones, the most important one among the Eastern Slavs. Also as leaders, also as mercenaries, right? Initially, the Vikings, but in general, right, would maintain peaceful trading relations with the Aboriginal Finnish tribes of the Baltic seashores and the Volga area, and the Slavs of northeastern Europe, right? There was no major political attrition. I mean, if one adventurer wanted to arrive, sack, rape, exterminate, well, he could do that. And surely there was some level of international awareness about who was connected with whom and so on. The Slavs did pretty much the same thing with one another, and basically any other people around did the same. But again, there was not a reason of major... Again, here we're not talking about like a migration era situation where an entire people is moving, right? These were just elements. So these elements found a space there to move in, and it was mostly at mutual benefit, right? For, again, especially strengthening the local political compaction through a military mean. They were mostly hired as mercenaries by the local Slavic rulers. That's how it worked. But when such mechanism began, naturally, I think became much more political, and so some bands headed by their leaders tried, often quite successfully, to seize power over the local populations, right? If you came in large enough numbers, right, this thing would work, right? This is a very interesting and recurrent dynamic, right? If you look at the migration era, it's basically the same thing, right? The Romans needed Germanic and other barbarian troops, right? They made them settle, etc. At some point, however, independently of the identity of these people, so generally speaking, just how they could coalesce, they could draw other troops from whatever, at some point they managed to take over, in some cases. As long as they were basically inserted in the Roman space as individually, this thing would not be a problem. When they started to migrate in larger numbers, it started being a problem, except, as we've seen, this at that time, that happened on a much larger scale. Scandinavia would actually suffer similar dynamics in the later Middle Ages, when the Germans basically took over, right? At some point in Scandinavian history, we've seen it in videos about medieval Denmark, medieval Sweden, also even in Norway, notoriously, the German mercenaries that at that point were basically leaving Germany en masse because there was a massive economic crisis. The ministerialis class was basically being, in fact, put down by the German princes. All these knights went abroad, right? And in some places they tried to take over because they were basically making up the entire military in some places. And Denmark at some point was ruled by one of these mercenaries. In Italy, they tried to take over certain seigneuries. Admittedly, that didn't succeed, but still, the numbers there were quite strong. These were alien, allogen elements, right? And they were the military professionals of the situation. Well, the same thing happened during the Viking era, right? With the Norse in Eastern Europe. In the 8th century, the Swedish Vikings who had founded the Aldegsborg site, that is to say today the old Ladoga set castle fortress. As you understand, even for how it developed later on, modest centers. Again, these were incredibly primitive places, right? We are not Eastern Europe in the 8th century. Do you have the palest idea of what this actually means? It's something terrifying. It's much worse than your worst nightmares can be. But these positions of power over certain rivers, over certain great water extensions, overlooking some important trade centers, would oblige anyone passing there paying something, because again, you control the stronghold. Somebody could assemble forces, mostly locally, to take you out. But if you were a random merchant, even if you were armed, if you had a retinue yourself, there was not really much you could do. Trying to storm a place, it was very complicated, and so they would just pay, right? It's just like the local mob, and it starts accumulating a substantial amount of wealth that for those times and spaces, is enormous. And on the base of that, hiring new troops, being, based politically, territorially, and starting to play a major role in the region, right? Exacting tribute at that point would be exacted not just from the travelers, but also from the locals that sense had to contribute in a more seriously, if they thought that such rule was kind of more advantageous for them, that they could make go. Again, it's not a fortress that controls the place. It's how people want this to happen. It was much more cooperation than mere imposition. There were factions pro and against these war bands, but more, normally for depending on whichever group had, in fact, the upper or lower hand locally, and how they would struggle with one another and call more of these war bands to, in fact, to sustain each other. So everything was very complex. Indeed, there were multiple fortress systems, in spite of the sparse population and so on. They cared about the most strategic points because of this massive international trade volume that had, by the way, been unprecedented, right, in historically in these areas. In the mid-9th century, the Swedes were driven out. Right, there was a substantially strong reaction against them because, of course, we're not exactly people, as we've seen, provided with much sense of human sensitivity, and the Slavs were really reciprocating in that way, and this proves how, again, depending the same Vikings had been on the local populace. But exactly for this, when an intestine war compelled the chiefs of the Slavonic tribes to seek for new protection, they would decide to transfer power, in fact, to a Jutland Earl, Rurik, that seemingly is the same guy that had been harassing the Carolingians in the west. This was a Dane, fundamentally, who had been carrying out actions of piracy also in the west. And there things were, especially at this point, the Carolingian Empire was not yet fallen. We are still kind of in the early Viking era. The expeditions are somehow still contained. In Eastern Europe, again, the political and social compaction was much looser, and so there were admittedly less riches locally, but more opportunities in relative terms to exploit, to take over the situation. And it was, again, the same Slavs who called this legion, which is also interesting because likely they knew what was happening in Scandinavia, what was happening in Central Europe. I make several videos about the general connection between, say, the world of literacy and the one, again, that we've seen also comprising the steppes didn't quite leave much, in fact, written accounts, but that knew what was going on much better than we think, right, in the civilized world. So Rurik came with, according literally to text, we've seen it in the video about, this is famous in the, eventually, as we read it from the Russian annals, with Sinus and Troiver, right? So literally his house and faithful warriors that instead were two terms, naturally Germanic in nature, would be maintained in the Slavic literature as personal names, Sineus and Trevor, right? Instead, these are, again, as we've seen, the household of this leader and his military retinue, practically. And so, again, they would move in a very coordinated way, knowing that it was a serious thing, a great opportunity, something that had to be logistically supported and so on. Again, this happened very often during the Middle Ages. In many other contexts, you have certain specific leaders that are called from the outside, not just, of course, provided with unlimited power that has never been achieved in the history of mankind, but very often with very specific rules to respect and, say, local customs to preserve, in fact, and with the purpose mostly of leading the army. That's the thing. Again, these war bands weren't the only thing that existed around it. There were the local Slavic elites, militias. We will talk about them. We already did it very often, but say we can't go by century, by region, because of course we know, as we will see now, about the same Slavic warfare to some important degree. In all this, the city of Kiev had been flourishing under the Khazar protection, right? We have seen in the previous video that this was basically the frontier, right, between the Eastern Slavs and the Khazar Empire, which responded a bit to the same dynamics that we just exposed, right? There was a bit differently, admittedly, compared to the type of power, right, from which this military protection arrived. So we've seen that the Norse were war bands, the Khazars were not maybe radically different in that sense, but they were a more compact power. The war band nature was more inherent to the decentralized position. But Kiev on the Dnieper River was a major, was rising, of course, to be the single most important Russian city, the one that would hegemonize the entire Eastern Europe from the top of her wealth and power. And that had been expanding exactly in the same way, right? The Khazars were exacting a tribute, providing for some military protection, And the Slavic community was also strengthening up themselves. They had their own elites. They were imitating naturally the Khazars, the Magyars, and the Norse, as we'll see now in equipment. They had some local traditions on their own, and they knew surely how to defend themselves from the most pressuring nomadic waves, which had been a prerogative of the Slavs from quite a while, from the dawn of their existence. So Kiev, as the northernmost outpost of the Khazar Empire, entered, basically switched allegiance, right? Was seized first by the former man-at-arms Rurik, right? At least there was this grand descent to the south to seize again the northern Russian lands were importantly, as we've seen, strategic by some degrees, certain strongholds and controlling the riverways and so on. But Kiev was really the biggest thing, right? So this was the largest center with the greater power, had also the greater draw, right? And Rurik and his family had been so successful, represented a bit the gold standard for that kind of military protection, or cooperation or even exploitation, right? Especially to get rid of the Khazar influence, because now times were mature for again this power to take over as an autonomous one. As you know, it would be the Kievan Rus to crush the Khazar Khaganate. So first you have Rurik, then Askild, and Tyrd, and there are some genealogical, here we are some in a time between history and myth, as far as we can reconstruct. But we know of different relatives of Rurik, for example, Elgi, the latter being succeeded to the throne by Rurik's son Ingvar, whose dynasty would reign over the Rus up to the 15th century, right? I made different videos about the Rus, comparing it to some other political models. The early Piast Poland was similar, right? This cluster of principalities that recognized a single dynasty fundamentally as provided with some essentially sacred character, again connected to their military exploit connections. There are again doubts about the entire chronology, genealogy. At some point, at least, we miss some ring from the chain, and we can legitimately also debate the historicity of some of these characters, but it all sounds plausible, right? And it definitely responds to the mechanism that we can broadly track for all this era, right? So the Rurikid dynasty, as it would be called, really held things together for quite a long time, and were a bit like, as we've seen, the Merovingians or other, again, powerful clans that had managed to establish themselves in a linear way, in a dynastic, sacred fashion, and essentially putting an end to the, let's say, the broader conflicts that would have arisen instead without a fixed center. This mostly passed through, in fact, also violent imposition, the destruction of rival groups, and the consequent compaction, concentration of power in the hands of these rulers that now were, as you understand, getting the upper hand, right? What we've seen here during the second invasions is that continental Europe too was, surely violated by these populations, but overall the Western world was becoming more powerful, right, than the rest. There was the tides were turning, and in the case of the Rus, the crushing of the Khazars and the general affirmation of their principalities corresponds to this kind of Western potential, to the Slavs, to the Norse, And at the end of the day, the triumph of the cemeteries, too, right, in the steppes. In Mediterranean would be the Christians taking over the sea, essentially marginalizing the Saracens. In Eastern Europe, it would be in part the Slavs consolidating the greater power in the area and relegating the steppes in another space, so much so that in the next episodes, hopefully we'll see this process. We'll be talking more about European sanitary powers venturing the steppes than the other way around. But at this point, the thing was pretty blended, because at the end of the day, they were still similar peoples by a degree, especially the elites. Shared a lot, also in military culture, in panoplies, in general lifestyle, and the same newcomers were taking on a bit the customs of the previous rulers, because that's what had been established as the standard, right? We'll see. Everything is clear when we pass to arms and armor, right? So all these perturbations exerted their influence on the formation of the early Russian warfare. The Vikings in the 9th and 10th centuries preferred swords with Frankish blades imported from the Rhineland, that was from the migration era, the most important metallurgic armor production center in Europe, right? These were the most advanced cultures. Technically, the famous Dane axe was actually a Frankish thing, right? Just like before the Francisca was throwing axe was actually a Roman thing. And we've seen it over and over again with the series about the steppes peoples, that actually the nomads, not in this case, they weren't nomads really, but this kind of the more tribal, the less developed cultures mostly would be able to create surely some original panoplies and fighting styles, techniques, and so on, but the items, the tools, the hardware came mostly, and this entire military development was stimulated by the great sanitary civilizations, who were by far more technologically advanced, right? So what we see also among the Scandinavians, notoriously, I made multiple videos about Scandinavian warfare during the Middle Ages, is of course a continuous import from Central Europe, right? During the Viking era, and later on, what the entire Scandinavian world, the Nordics, what they would be influenced by was the Frankish world, right? Where the Frankish Roman Catholics at all level, politically, militarily, socially, they would become essentially feudal Christian states on the longer run, right? So all the best hardware came from there. Admittedly, there was a lot of Eastern influence too. This was absolutely evident in these eras. There was a lot, as we'll see now, of Khazar hardware, for example, that we find, but also from other steppes peoples in prior times, especially in Sweden, the easternmost of the Norse, that were quite influenced in their fascias by this kind of Asian arms and armor style, right? There is no doubt about that. We find stuff coming as far as from India, right? In places like Scandinavia, we find, again, even to Iceland, stuff from Central Asia, because they arrived this as a product of trade in the first place. But for such a warlike culture, naturally the most important thing was getting a lot of blades of armor, and the closest center, and a hell of a very advanced one that exported arms and armor across the Mediterranean as well to the same Arabs from different places. Look at Charlemagne's diplomatic gifts to Baghdad, or what the Venetians exported, that is, weapons even against the papal ban and Slavic slaves from Dalmatia to the Egyptians. Well, that was the main center. The Frankish military culture was, Frankish culture was exclusively military. Admittedly, at this point, of course, there had been an ecclesiastical reform. The Roman influence had been quite penetrating, and so on. But to look at the essential core of Central Europe, Gaul, Western Francia, Eastern Francia, these are basically just feudal or proto-feudal societies. They think only about armor, horses, and land. Right? There is nothing else that a Frank does. There is not properly in his mental horizons anything different than raiding, campaigning on horseback his entire life, and being all about, again, blades, war horses, continuous physical training, etc. Right? And surely peoples like the Vikings give the Franks a lot to do. Also on this front, but you find the Franks exporting arms and armor. Right? In Gaul, you realize that even the success of Viking raids in great part was connected with, as we've seen for the Slavs, the same Franks that simply let the Vikings pass because they said, okay, well, these guys will maybe raze to the ground the castle of my asshole neighbor, and it's okay, and we can maybe even create a marketplace where we can share the loot, right? And that's how it happened in the political disintegration of Western Francia, right? And then things, went a bit too far with the Norse really hitting hard, and so, they began to organize themselves in a bit more of a consistent way to blockade the major French rivers with fortified bridges. The Vikings would arrive to besiege Paris, interestingly enough, even with a substantial polyurcetic capacities, throwing engines and stuff like that, but basically the bailout there, right, from the 10th century, it's mostly about England. Gaul has become too dangerous. The Frankish aristocracy naturally are consolidating very powerfully, so it's all another game. But the hardware influence of Scandinavia is very, very, very strong, right? The finest blades of the Vikings used were Frankish. Famously enough, as we remember before, the Scandinavians fought with battle axes, right? We have the double-handed axe that is a bit like the most iconic one. As we were saying before regarding heroic individualism, the idea is that the Norse German-speaking have less of a mounted elite, as we've seen, or even if they are, they dismount to fight quite often. You can't use double-handed weapons on horseback, right? That's the same reason why you don't see them later on with double-handed swords during the Middle Ages, nor even with battle axes, right? The only double-hand thing you can use is a spear, right? Is a contest. So the function of the Danish axe is basically ripping the torso of a person apart in spite of armor, right? Technically, the coat of mail, that was the main armor of the Vikings, as we'll see now, was designed exactly to withstand such blows. They were extremely powerful, right? The Norse were big, right? We know the average Viking was something 180 centimeters tall, but it's not much about their height. It's their size, it's their weight, it's their beefiness. It's the fact that these people have been genetically selected in the most traumatically violent environment existing in Europe, or barely, at least, surely, if we exclude some parts of the, of the East as well, the same steppes, right? And so, as a consequence, they, over the millennia, right, with terrible weather, literally the strongest, the beefiest had been selected, right? It's not even just about that the greatest selection is always human, right? Remember that the way we are, the way we have, chosen people over the generations is because we literally took out the others, right? And even our criteria of beauty that is a value in this world will remain in the chivalric way. It had always been a thing. They connected the moral and the physical value at the same time. Is that this most severely impacting, right? These peoples had been killing each other for forever. Admittedly, Scandinavia was not one of the most violent places up to a relatively short time before. Continental Germany had been most radically brutal in many ways, but it's that individual touch, right? That the Viking era, of course, starts to bring in new kinetic energy and so on. But it's the political and social organization. It's not much the warlikeness per se. It's the fact that the individual is more central, right? And so it's also more physically select, right? And so the necessity of knowing how to handle a double-handed axe to split open like a cucumber somebody's rib cage was crucial, right? Or a horse skull, right? And while the coat of mail was designed fundamentally to neutralize such blows, in the sense that at least that the same weapons would damage themselves in the process, but still, first of all, the impact doesn't matter how much clothes, stuff, padded stuff was worn beneath whatever. If you receive some of these blows, just can't bleed out from internal trauma. It's terrifying. But the idea is that the physicality needed to be able to breach through a coat of mail is exemplified by these axemen, right? There are lots of other axes around, smaller ones that had always been going on, also around the migration era. This, very large knives, for example, things like that. We will not talk about this now, but this weapon is the maximization of that function. The reason why it was invented by the Franks, but it didn't become so, identifying the people, is that, again, the Franks fought on horseback, right? So in order to break somebody's armor, right, just a good spear hit during cavalry charge was enough. On foot, as you mostly find as a Scandinavian, well, you can't use this stuff, and so it becomes kind of more iconic. Add that kind of warriorism to it, and you have it, right? Needless to say, the Viking infantries were very courageous, right? And they became heavier over time, more select, as we've seen, more professional, right? Even I made a video about the Leidang, and we've seen that this fundamentally diminished over time in terms of direct participation. Basically, it's a sort of feudalism kicking in. The peasants give up their freedom, which means the one of bearing arms, and so defending themselves, they just place themselves under a lord that will shelter them from these other crazes that go around sacking, murdering, whatever. And he will just pay something out of his, of his harvest and stuff to pay the huskarls, so the man of the house, literally the followers. We've seen also the trover, these devotees, right, maintained at that point by the Lord. This is happening again in Europe as well. The same with the masnate, with the encastellation. It's the same identical thing. Just a bit less horses. Just imagine like that, and so more double-handed axes, stereotypically speaking. For the rest, there are lots of similarities, except indeed the Scandinavian gear is much poorer, more primitive, and sometimes even more anachronistic. But surely the elites know how to get the very best, and that's why, because in the shield wall they have to be able to smash through and to again massacre a large amount of people, because that's basically how all they have with the dramatic poverty of the land to prove anything, right? To be reliable, to be someone you would die for, because all the retinue, at least those who wanted to make fortune under, and being free themselves under these leaders were they had vowed themselves, right, and to just to die rather than being less than their leaders, and so that's how they went by. Naturally, this wouldn't prevent constant feuding, assassinations, betrayals. Again, this is typical, and that's the sense of the dark destiny of the world approaching, the dimming of the sacred in the heart of man because of the loosening of this kind of faith bond, right? And everything becomes that more collectively vicious as far as the military capacities are concerned. The Viking spears were provided with long, either narrow or very broad heads, depending on the function. Some heads were designed to properly break through armor, properly forcing the joints, things like that. Others were conceived just to cause massive cuts, right? Literally, again, opening people up with just the sheer brutal force of the same. Remember that armor is not that frequently around because it costs way too much, right? And for the average person, it's going to cost, in relative terms, way too much. And so there's a lot of genuine chopping, right? Without too many things that you could oppose in that sense to it. The luckiest, as we've seen, the most affluent, would wear a mail coat, a rounded helmet with there are various types, but stereotypically you have the half mask or a blind cameo, right? It looks cool and aesthetical enough to have made it into pop culture as if it was the only thing the Vikings were. Not really. Definitely headgear would be the first concern for any armor, say, basics, let's say, protection. Then the troops would be equipped with a round wooden shield with an iron umbo, and most of the fighters that were basically farmers, because Vikings were a minority of the Scandinavian population, so the entire system was all one. They had slaves, the thralls in the farms, and etc. But the average farmer wasn't that nightly devoted to that kind of professional lifestyle. Yes, they would know about raiding warfare, killing someone every once in a while, but just what Luthvak would call low intensity kind of war. They admittedly they were great warriors. They knew as far as the terrain exploitation, like living out there in the wilderness in this terrifying environment. But as we've seen in terms of collective capacities, they weren't too much. And this is the reason why the only way to make things orderly on the field was creating this mostly infantry blocks, for which the shields had to be overlapping, because the union there, you couldn't count on a single guy, of let's say an average guy, to be just, again, this warrioristically aggressive, individualistic-minded offender, right? This is what Europe was, say, in the Bronze Age, in the early Iron Age, right? You can't talk about that for the Celts, for the Italics. But in these areas, the question was much more now settled, right, or more civilized and spent, right? So the average guy was just hoping to survive by sticking in this what is called shield wall, which is a terrible term, at least for how it's been popularized, because I don't know how to tell you, break this down to you, but every single people that had shields, in history made what you call as shield walls, and shield walls are not formations, are not a tactic, are not basically anything. It's just a guy pairing stuff, arriving to them with a shield, and offending, hopefully, otherwise it would be just runaways. So the shield doesn't have much of a function. You can break somebody's teeth with the umbo, or toying a bit with various movements. You can, of course, couple with a sword, with a spear, whatever. But there is no specific Vikingness in shield walls, and nor there is any specific Vikingness, any specific shield walledness in Viking military capacities, right? These peoples, if anything, are, again, as any people here, they are offensively minded. They just adapt to, as we've seen now, this different type of background they may have. But the reason why they would just have flat shields interlocking is that it was the simplest thing, right? That having flat shields interlocking is not a proof of particular hardness of infantry in line of principle. It just means that you can have very thick ranks that not necessarily would always be there, by the way, especially in those situations. I mean, Scandinavia, the northern Germans came also from the migration era, normally with smaller shields. At this point, admittedly, they have them basically the same size of the other peoples. But again, this can happen if you have just enough troops that can form a decent line. But again, what is preferable is not, let's say, as a qualitative force, is one of professionals that can go around being quite thickly compact, no doubt, but that mostly have offensive capacities to break through, not much to defend per se, right? So staying close, staying compact for an infantry formation against another infantry formation is quite important, but you're not winning because you just have shields superimposing one another. You win because you can crush the skull of the person in front of you, and you have the moral capacity of doing it. That's the single most important thing. All the rest is bullshit, practically. So, maintaining cohesion was something that, as we've seen, was precarious. And generally speaking, in this context, and this is why, of course, just the front ranks would be made up of the best troops, as it was already, as is normally the case in basically throughout all military history, because those are the guys who have basically to hold and guide the others. A match of warfare at the end of the day gets down to how, say, more orderly you carry out your maneuvers, how freshly in relatively order you can bring your troops to the point of the attack, hopefully catching the enemy by surprise with flank attacks and things like that. And the rest goes as far as the moral force of the individuals are, let's say, and of the collectives naturally is concerned, and not much other ways of how you keep weapons or whatever. It's because weapons were used in the most differentiated way. Also, the pigs and out formation didn't quite exist in the sense you mean, right? The pigs and out formation was mostly a simple flat linear front, like all the others, not a triangle, not a conus, right? Just a concentrated amount of elite troops in a single place of the line that would hopefully break the opposite side. It had nothing to do with the sense of the pyramid. There were things like that in the sense that there were some breaking points in some areas that would have to expose themselves more than the others, but it's not a recipe for particular military success. Also because, as we'll see now, as soon as you arrive to the front lines, you find lots of projectiles falling on you, right? So it's not really convenient to place your best guy in the very front and single line in rank, against the entire enemy arm. In any case, there was still this kind of warband devotees mentality, again, as we've seen for the berserkers, the Ulfadnars. The idea is that these were chthonic beasts that the initiates in the warbands entered and became, right, or better, the beast took over the guy, because it was the only way to teach him, in theory, how to tame such dark chthonic necrophagous forces while they were in the lower ranks, then the more you rose through the ranks and you could discipline yourself, passing through this other mortal tests like being sent literally like crazy against the enemy lines, etc., and only sorting out ways to survive, unless you were killed in the process. That was a very convenient way of selecting. You would rise to the more Apollonian, Uranian side of the story, hopefully by that point having become a leader, somebody that with higher status. Consider that people during the initiation rites were killed. Often these people literally lived in the wilderness like animals. It's not much about drugs or other strange external effects that it could receive. It's just the entire lifestyle and their entire vocation and self-constant practically torture, right? Because if you enter these brotherhoods, were, again, mostly you had to survive a hell of a beating and whatever kind of psychophysical abuse to be even accepted as such, tortures of every kind, and this was the only way in such a desperate world to trust the person who was next to you. You were destroyed as a human being and remounted like a literal animal that had exclusively to kill people, drink their bloods, whatever. And these people remain, we know from the sagas, they remained traumatized. I made multiple videos about, of course, this topic, and the sense was that life was so brutally short that it was just better to have this youth conceived like that as part of these outcasts roaming around the villages and so on that you could hire, gather for certain other engagements. Because normally people would have died anywhere, or at least they had a sin that they had to expiate, or so they were literally told the hard way how to behave. And arguably there was a degree of this in any kind of freeman. Right? If you look at Germanistics, you look at Tacitus, there were even entire tribes that allegedly turned into beasts. Think about the Lugi, this is described at some point. As we were referring to before, the Berserkers, the Ulfvednars, etc., were becoming a narrower group, right? First a sort of elite, then ever less so. So that at the end of the day they were just homeless people with severe mental disorders, and it wouldn't quite, again, have a place on the battlefields, especially when feudal cavalry came around just to run over them. But again, the things they would do surely mirror the only ways they had to desperately maintain any kind of standards of cohesion, make up for the collective discipline that these groups lacked. And that's why they became obsolete, as the Viking era was instead consolidating more professional models. Right? But they were always mixed in a way. Of course, these warriors were adorned with torques, arm rings, because that literally meant that you didn't belong to yourself as a human being anymore. You belonged just to God, and to this hypothesis that you had been given in the as a lower rank of a savage animal, that you had to basically just try with your own forces to tame, so that you could elevate yourself to a higher status condition spiritually, and just in theory like equating to a greater power, right? So this was, if you read the Song of Igor, etc., you find even very powerful, in that case, Rusian princes that were told to go out at night like werewolves and being quite distinctive in such a way. And they were old practice. We will see it even with the Kumans. The steppes peoples did pretty much the same thing. All this practice came from the Proto-Indo-European background in the steppes. So we're talking essentially the same language. all the legion, the Danish legions of the Iron Chains, and all the legions of the Werewolf, they all stemmed from this. And the sense is that also a more advanced military culture, like the one brought by the Franks, etc., was basically taming these people that were demonized, not because they believed in an allegedly pagan religion and not in the Christian one, because the religion was only one, but because the way of the first was evidently superseded, crushed, destroyed, defeated by the one of the latter, the one of reason, of the Apollonian order, rationality that wiped the floor out of these people on the long run. So this is very important, right? Very, very, very important to understand. If we look instead at the Slavs protagonist of the the Russian foundation, providing with the numerical bulk at least of the forces, even under the Rikids and so on. By the 8th, 9th century, they comprised, as in earlier times, spears, javelins, battle axes, and bows. Admittedly, their panoply had not evolved dramatically, but there had not been much of a need for it. They had been mostly living in the forests, defending their villages, their fortified hilltops from the raids of the Turks from the steppes. They had very poor surplus up to this point, whereas we've seen trade was making them substantially richer, developing a mercantile estate that could also provide ship, all the arms and armor, just even imported from other places. They protected themselves with large oval shields that had been very important against the horse archers' arrows, and the Slavic crescent from the Balkans to Central Europe to Eastern Europe would develop very distinctive type of shields historically, exactly for this anti-nomadic cavalry reasons. The Slavs had been mostly infantrymen, but gradually their elites had become wealthier and influenced by the same steppes nomads. They had been marrying to each other, etc. The Russians of the Dnipro area, especially the inhabitants of Kiev and Chernihiv, borrowed many elements of weaponry from the steppe peoples, in fact, namely the Magyars and the Khazars. We've seen these peoples in previous videos, and you know how advanced their warfare was for the time, how smart especially. The Magyars were a bit wilder but agile. The Khazars had been developing some sort of, feudal heavy cavalry and sedentarizing a bit more. The same Slavic fortified hilltops had owed that process of encapsulation in these frontier areas. To Scandinavian shields and swords were added spheroconical helmets of the steppes, a distinctive bow set, and richly decorated belts. Right, mounted combat became more and more widespread, and the attention of the Rus was attracted by the steppe saber, which was ideal for hit-and-run tactics, skirmishes, right? Because as the trade balance was shifting, also the Slavs, the Rus were retaking the initiative, as we were saying, and they were making incursions into Khazar territories and so on. So the saber is an ideal weapon for especially lighter cavalry. The straight massive swords of the Iranian times required a much greater training. Also, the Frankish ones weren't kidding either. There were massive sabers that required enormous training, but on average the saber requires less. So you can tendentially keep a larger amount of cavalrymen, even from places like the one of Eastern Europe, where the Slavs do not have an overwhelming amount of cavalry. But in these areas, it would be easy, to transform a humble Slavic farmer in some sort of retinue horsemen. Considered that by 11th century, we know that I made a video about the Polish army organization, right? 1/3 of the Polish, so, and that's Central Europe, that's not Eastern Europe. Just think about the Rus. Had 1/3 of the troops mounted, right? They weren't particularly heavy. That's also the thing, right? In the West, they had better cavalry, but they were less in that regard, and more advanced too. So again, here lighter troops on average, a bit like as we've seen in the steppes, the Turks open to this phase of increasing, say, social stratification, where the average horseman was lighter and lighter. We are in the early Middle Ages. There is very poor stuff around. The saber is excellent for cutting, to leave this, horrendous wounds just with a small hit passing by riding. And that's as nasty as many other weapons that were employed here, as we've seen throwing axes, composite bows, all used on horseback too, naturally. So a hybrid, as you understand. In the north of the Rus, the horse harness was decorated mostly after the Scandinavian fashion, while in the south it was hardly distinguishable from the one of the Magyars and of the Khazars. Obviously not. So there was a sort of syncretism of Scandinavian and the steppe Khazaro-Magyar cultures, based in turn on the local Slavic and Finnish substratum. So a unicum historically, like in this kind of west-east weather. Of course, by some degree comparisons are possible, but this, at least in European standards, it's very fascinating, right? There was, especially in the time of greater Varangian success, so the Varangian term is used because these were the ones that swore an oath, that were war bands traveling around. So at the peak of that, what you see is a bit more of a sort of factotum warrior, which is not a bad word. Simply means that it would have been more likely for this kind of Varangian leaders to be a bit of everything, like swordsmen, axemen, archers. This was normal really for everyone involved. It was true for the Normans, for the Byzantines, for the Franks, for the Arabs. But since we said that was a bit more of a transition phase, like one from a more tribal, seasonal, individualistic, heroic world into a sort of more professional, feudal, at least as far as the elite was concerned, permanent character. You have a bit of a mix in between. It's a bit like when in the steppes warfare you have in Saka's times the maximum combination between shock element and missile power combined in a single guy. Eventually things relax and there is more of a tactical distinction between the two types. Before, everything is more primitive. There is a kind of a middle golden ground in which instead things go a bit more in tandem, right? And these are the moments, especially the 10th century. That's a hell of a moment for this type of warfare. And the combination was lighter than the Eastern panoply, but more diversified than the Western one, and all in all very functional for the type of grounds, the vicious grounds. I mean, Eastern Europe is terrifying if you think about that. In general, marshes, forests, ambushes, this kind of terrible enemies you can have, or either from the steppes or from this local stubborn infantries. So going through there for all the desire of riches and of fortune, etc., it's a huge adventure, and it exemplifies very well the time of the Varangians, that, as you know, were serving abroad from Scandinavia into the Rus, in Constantinople, in Italy, again from the Caspian Sea to Spain, everywhere, right? Great travelers, great sailors, as you know, and great warriors as a consequence. A life of risk, of daring, very, very poor reward, telling the truth. But for those who succeeded and made it big, right, there was a lot of excitement and fantasies and admiration and ambition and sense of emulation. And all these war bands worked a bit like that. They were all obsessed with getting out of that, say, miserable life of the north to enjoy the riches of the south, and making a great fortune as, say, a Varangian guard, the ruler of Miklagard, and beyond. Because again, what would have thought of greater, and that how the name really says, of Constantinople, a guy born and raised in, I don't know, 10th century Sweden. I mean, seriously. That's all the motivation that you need, right? And I made video about the Varangian Guard. We've seen how many, right? We think about the Varangian Guard just like in the video games, with the ultra elite cool guys with a double-handed axe. But actually, the Varangian Guard was a tactically complete army on its own, and an enormous amount of Scandinavians were settled in the Balkans throughout that time. Some descended, arguably, they surely even joined the Magyars, maybe in some raid in Central Europe, they went south. There are Nordic traces in places like, in the Danubian area and so on. So we know they went pretty much anywhere. And they left their traces. That's quite an important thing. And the interesting thing, I would add, that is that it continued just a millenary tradition. I mean, what's the difference in this sense between, even just considering the spaces, between these guys and some Goths that had descended from Scandinavia, crushing the Iranians and establishing a rule on their own on the Black Sea, right? The same places, the same, just the first starting points, the same destinations, and more or less the same dynamics, right? So also here, but the same mechanisms are repeating themselves over and over again. So all in all, when you look at stereotypically the 10th century, practically all the elements of weaponry and military equipment of the new state of Russia could have been manufactured in the workshops of the principal cities of what had become, we could say provocatively, as the Kagan of the Rus, right? Because this formation had been established, as we've seen, largely also on what had been controlled previously by certain Turkic Khaganates, and now taking over and bringing the Slavs in part even to migrate further, like the Scandinavian, where we're colonizing the Finns, for example. And so this Western thing, this push towards the East, that has already started from these frontier areas. And the main bases of the powerful Kievan Rus were naturally Kiev, Chernihiv. This happened, this armor production also in Ladoga. We have Novgorod, Smolensk, Polotsk again, and all these centers are essentially major fortified markets that develop all a sort of settlement system, trade. They attract craftsmen, merchants from quite faraway places, and that's where all these powerful, wicked rulers can draw their own human and material resources from, right? Provided that, so interestingly enough, the Slavs developed their own mercantile oligarchies and have a very strong sense of themselves, and there is always a balance, right? One of the reasons of the Russian success is the balance, the dialectic between the princely element and the local, say, urban element in a way, right? When this system starts tilting towards an erosion of the balance, you have, and that's also part of the reason why these places were invested hard and hit hard and by the Mongols later on, is that they had already been crippled from the within. So we'll talk about the Kievan Rus further, because it's one of the most important pages of course, in medieval history. And this was a bit the outlook, again, from a military point of view of these people. There would be a lot more to that. Slavic warfare, itself, it's not even that different actually from the Scandinavian one, as we described it, right? Just some Scandinavians had more of a Frankish kick / vibe. So they were a bit more updated, a bit more modern. The Slavs, as we've seen, had just now been taking some, let's say, I'm talking military, right? Not necessarily in the sense that the Slavs didn't have their own elites, or they weren't becoming actually more prosperous than the Scandinavians, of course, through the Rus. But they are comparable by a degree, right? And there is a different social segmentation. They're less socially, say, as far as the Viking elites are supported by Luton, the Slavs are less socially stratified, and they have more difficulty to put forces together to launch, say, to start essentially what the Scandinavians were doing, right, under the same level. And that's why they are basically obliged to receive these troops and to exploit, to install them, and to essentially nurture them and to become their own, right? But it's just the shift there, the push, this demographic force in Eastern Europe that manages to take a place in towards the south, toward the control of the great Russian rivers, to strip there, to undermine the Khazar power, to reach Constantinople, to establish a process of civilization, of Christianization, and more. Of course, it's difficult to simplify this in a few words, but again, we will hopefully look at these things more in detail on another occasion. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.